November 14th, 1964, 9:18 p.m. In a smoke-choked restaurant on Lenox Avenue, a man in a cheap coat allowed another man to spit in his face in front of 30 witnesses. No one fired. No one screamed. But in that minute, a war began in Harlem with a simple stake. Either he becomes a king without a crown, or he disappears so quietly it's as if he never existed. And the worst part wasn't what happened in plain sight. It was that someone in the room had already sold him out before the spit even dried. At 9:22, the doors opened and Clarence Jackson walked in. The black suit on him was too new for a man with his reputation, and his smile was too wide for a night with no funeral. He wasn't a boss. He was a heavy soldier from an opposing crew, the kind they send to do things that are meant to become legend. Behind him were two men, one with a tight haircut and cold eyes, the other in a coat with the collar up, hands in his pockets as if the answer to any question was sitting inside. Jax paused by the entrance. Not from hesitation, because it was a show. He gave the room time to understand what it meant. An outsider had stepped onto territory without permission. The saxophone seemed to stumble for a beat. The bartender stopped polishing his glass. Someone at the next table pressed a cigarette into the ashtray, so hard cracked. Frank didn't move. His eyes stayed on the door like a clock. He saw seconds where other people saw only men. Jax came over slowly, unhurried, like a predator who knows the prey is tied up. He stopped at Frank's table, leaned in just enough so the whole room could hear every word. "So it's you. Lawson," he said, tasting the name like it had flavor. "They say you're the king here. But I'm looking, and the crown seems to be missing." He smiled at the room like he was hosting the night. "Maybe they gave it to you on credit?" Bobby Ray tensed. Ellie Whisper was already looking under the table, into the place where there was nothing but darkness and habit. Frank set down his fork slowly. Not sharp, not as a challenge. Like a man who doesn't want metal to clink. "Sit if you're hungry," he said quietly, but loud enough that the words drifted over the music like smoke. "If not, don't stand over people's food." Jax laughed. "Short, rough. Hear that? He's polite." He leaned closer, close enough that Frank caught the smell of mint mixed with cheap whiskey. "I thought kings knew how to bite." And then, without breaking eye contact, he spit in Frank's face. The sound was wet, short, humiliating, and the silence that fell over the room turned thicker than the smoke. Someone at the bar froze with a glass halfway to their mouth. The saxophonist on stage snapped a note like someone squeezed his throat. Frank didn't wipe it with his sleeve. He didn't hide behind a napkin. He raised his eyes slowly and, just as slowly, extended his hand. He took Jax by the wrist. Firm, calm, no yirk. It didn't look like an attack. It looked like control, like an adult stopping a child who's playing too loudly at the edge of a roof. For a moment, Jax didn't even understand what was happening. His smile hung in the air. Frank turned Jax's palm upward, and without looking away, pressed it to his own cheek. He wiped the spit off his face with Jax's hand. Slowly, carefully, as if he wasn't cleaning dirt. He was erasing Jax's right to breathe in that room. A few people flinched. Someone quietly sucked in a breath, because this was worse than a punch. Humiliation delivered cold, without shouting, without haste. Frank released the wrist, and only then, almost casually, lifted his palm to his own men. "Don't touch him." Then he said evenly, so the nearest tables could all hear. "Thank you. You did it in front of witnesses." Jax still had a grin, but it wasn't holding him anymore. He stepped back half a pace, like he was trying to take the scene back, like laughter could turn it all into a joke again. "What? You decide to become a priest?" He threw at the room, loud enough to ease the pressure in his own throat. "You wipe my hand like a mom wiping snot." A few people gave nervous little chuckles, but the laugh didn't spread. It dropped to the floor like a coin into an empty glass. Frank didn't move. He didn't wipe himself immediately. He let the dampness dry on his skin, so every second became part of the memory. Then, almost like it was ordinary, he took a white napkin, dabbed the corner of his mouth, folded it neatly like a receipt, and set it on the table. And again, silence, because everyone expected him to say something pretty, something that could be repeated at a bar. But Frank spoke the way men speak when they don't sell words. He looked at Jax and said quietly, but so clearly the nearest tables heard every letter, "You came here for a reputation. I just gave you one." Jax tried to fake indifference, but his fingers betrayed him. They clenched and unclenched, like he suddenly remembered hands aren't just for show. "You didn't give me anything," he answered too fast. "You're just sitting there like a statue." Frank tilted his head a millimeter. "Statues stand a long time," he said. "You walk." It wasn't said like a threat. That's exactly why it sounded like a sentence. Before you find out what Frank did next, let me ask you, have you ever walked into a room knowing Deutschner that your next step would change your life forever? Have you ever had to choose between respect and survival? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story matters. By 9:41, they were already outside. The cold November wind slapped their faces like the street's backhand. On the corner of 132nd stood a blue 1962 Ford Galaxy, clean, with no extra shine. Frank slid into the back seat without taking off his gloves. Ellie got in front, Bobby behind the wheel. "Where to?" Bobby asked. Frank gave him an address. 135th between Adam Clayton Powell and Frederick Douglass. There's a phone booth there that loves other people's conversations. 20 minutes later, Ellie was at the booth dialing the number of a man Harlem called Mr. Paper. Almost nobody knew his real name, because paper could be more dangerous than a gun. "I need everything on Clarence Jackson," Ellie said. "Who he rides for, who he pays, who his driver is, where he gets money, where he makes mistakes." A pause, then a voice dry, emotionless. "That'll cost you." Ellie glanced through the glass at Frank. Frank nodded. "How much?" "3 grand cash. Tomorrow. No bargaining." "Done," Ellie said and hung up. That same night, Frank made another call, shorter. He phoned the 28th Precinct NYPD, not like a criminal, but like a man who knows where the dirt is buried. The desk sergeant heard only a calm voice. "Tell Detective Richards I have a story for him about a man named Clarence Jackson. Tomorrow, 8 a.m., outside Cleo's on 125th. If he doesn't show, he'll miss his chance to make a name." Frank didn't give his own name. He didn't need to. Some things in Harlem traveled faster than introductions. By morning, a new rumor already hung in the air. They spit in Lawson's face, and he didn't even stand up. To many, it sounded like weakness. To people who could count, it sounded like the silence before a siren. Bobby Ray heard 2 guys at a gas station laughing. King without a crown. Ellie clenched his jaw, but Frank just stared ahead. He needed their laughter. It made the enemy bolder. And bold people make mistakes at speed. At 7:58 the next day, Detective Richards actually showed up at Cleo's. His coat was old, but his shoes were clean. Cops like that aren't easy to buy with money. You buy them with facts. He sat across from Frank without asking permission. "Who are you?" he asked. Frank set an envelope on the table. Inside wasn't cash. It was a photograph, Jack's, 6 months earlier, by a warehouse door in the Bronx, beside a man with a well-known last name Richards had wanted to hear out loud in court for a long time. "I'm a man who doesn't like it when the street gets arrogant," Frank said. "And you're a man who doesn't like it when it gets out of control." Richards stared at the photo longer than he needed to. "Where'd you get this?" "This is just the beginning," Frank answered. "I want you to know, Jax is betting nobody will touch him, because he thinks the people behind him are the ones you're afraid of." Richards lifted his eyes. "And who's behind you?" Frank gave a faint smile. "My accounts. And my memory." Richards snorted. "You want something? I want you on the scene when he makes his next move," Frank said. "And I want you to remember who handed you the key." It was an ultimatum without the word ultimatum. Frank wasn't offering friendship. He was offering position. "And if I don't play?" Richards asked. Frank leaned in. "Then someone else becomes the hero of this story, and you'll read it in the paper like everyone else." Richards stood, took the photo as if it belonged to him, and said on the way out, You're playing dangerous, Lawson. Frank didn't correct him on the name. Let him think he already knew. Back in Harlem, Frank didn't go home. He drove to 142nd, to a small barber shop where the walls knew more than the radio. The barber was an old man named Leroy, who heard everything because men loved to talk while a razor held their throat. Frank sat in the chair like a regular customer. "Jax," he said, watching himself in the mirror. "Who's holding him?" Leroy drew the razor along Frank's cheek slowly. "He's underneath satin clay," he whispered. "Not the boss, but close. And you know what else?" Frank didn't move. "He's deep in debt. And when you're in debt, people get loud." At 3 p.m., Ellie brought the first packet from Mr. Paper. Addresses, numbers, names of drivers, notes about debts at a pawn shop on 116th, a promissory note for $7,000 signed by Jax. And the most interesting part, his cousin's name, a guy working for a transport company in Jersey who sometimes accidentally lost shipping manifests. "This is his blood," Ellie said, tapping the paper. "This is how he moves product." Frank looked past the numbers, at weaknesses. "Product is just product," he said. "I need his people, his loyalty, his feeling that he's protected." He picked up the promissory note. "This is a thread." That night, Frank did what many would call insanity. He showed up at the funeral of an old neighborhood uncle, not a boss, but a man respected by everyone, from the church crowd to the bar crowd. The service was in a church on 137th. Wooden pews, the smell of wax, black hats, eyes wet and dry at the same time. Everyone who mattered was there. It was a stage where every gesture became news. Frank entered at exactly 7:06 p.m. No flashy security. Just Ellie a few steps behind. He walked to the casket, placed an envelope on the lid. Not money. A letter. Someone nearby whispered, "What's he doing?" Frank didn't answer. He turned and met the gaze of Nate Satin Clay, standing by a column like a shadow in a suit. Nate smiled, but his eyes didn't. "Lawson," he said when Frank stepped close. "Heard they served you at Maribel Chura without a napkin." It was said quietly, but loud enough that a few heads turned. Frank didn't swallow the insult. He let it hit the floor like a cigarette. "But I heard your boy likes theater," Frank said. "So do I, especially when there are witnesses." Nate leaned in. "You want me to punish him?" he whispered. "You want me to show who the father is around here?" Frank looked him in the eye. "I want you not to touch him," Frank said. Nate froze. "What?" "Let him live," Frank repeated. "Let him talk. Let him walk. Let him think he won." Nate slowly stepped back, like Frank had just said something more dangerous than a threat. "You play the long game," Nate whispered. Frank nodded. "I always play the long game." After the service, people whispered. Lawson didn't break. He didn't even ask for an apology. He asked for time. It was strange, and strange always scares people. But right then came the first hit Frank hadn't planned. When he and Ellie stepped into the cold, a messenger boy approached with a yellow envelope. "For you, mister," the kid said, and disappeared into the crowd. No signature. Inside was a short note. "You think the spit is the end? It's only a mark. Tonight, one of yours will say more than he should. Check your people. 11:30. Corner of 128th and Lexington." Ellie went pale. "It's a trap," he said. Frank folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "Maybe," he answered. "Or maybe it's a warning." He looked at Ellie like he could see through him. "Tell me the truth," Frank said quietly. "When Jax walked into Maribel, who knew we'd be there at that exact time?" Ellie opened his mouth, but nothing came out, because the answer was simple and filthy. Only their own people knew. At 11:27, they were on the corner of 128th and Lexington. Streetlights flickered like the city was nervous. Bobby Ray sat in the car, engine idling softly. Frank stood in the shadow under a fire escape and watched a familiar figure approach the corner. Not an enemy, one of his second circle guys. A kid named Tommy even, who sometimes ran packages and loved to talk when he thought his friends were listening. Tommy stopped at a phone booth and dialed. Frank couldn't hear the words, but he could read the body. Hunched shoulders, glances over the shoulder, hands shaking. And then, from the dark across the street, Jax appeared. Not alone, two men with him, and another car rolling in without headlights. This wasn't random. This was a hunt. And Tommy looked like bait that had brought both Frank and the enemy to the same spot. Ellie whispered, "He sold us." Frank didn't answer. He watched Jax, smiling in the darkness like a man who thought he'd already won. Jax lifted a hand and pointed at Frank as if he knew exactly where he was. "Lawson," he shouted, loud enough for the windows to hear. "Come out. Let's talk like men. No napkins." Tommy turned his head and saw Frank. His face broke with fear. He tried to speak, but didn't get the chance. The headlightless car stopped hard, a door opened, and a man in a dark coat stepped out. He didn't shout. He simply carried a folder. A folder, not a gun. The man walked closer and said flatly, "Mr. Lawson, you're under arrest. Federal. Suspicion of transporting stolen goods and conspiracy." He flashed a badge that caught the streetlight. It was a hit that changed the rules. Not a street war. Not eye for eye. This was the system stepping onto the board, and someone had let it here run it. Frank raised his hand slowly, not as surrender, but as a pause. He looked at Jax. Jax wasn't smiling anymore. He looked shocked, like it wasn't his plan, like someone had used him too. Tommy stood trembling, and his face said only one thing: "They threw me away as well." Ellie wanted a lunge, but Frank lifted his palm again. "Don't touch him." The federal agent stepped closer, and in that second Frank understood the worst truth. The spit hadn't just been humiliation. It was a mark for an operation that had been building for a long time. Someone fed Jax the idea. Someone sent a note. Someone wound up Tommy. And if Frank made the wrong move now, he wouldn't just lose, he'd become an example. Quiet. Educational. For everyone. Frank looked up at the sky, which always seemed lower than it should in Harlem, and said very softly, so only Ellie heard, "They've been leading us the whole time." Then, louder, to the federal, "I'll go with you. But first, one question. Who gave you my name?" The federal didn't answer. He clenched his jaw and said, "Hands on the car." Jax backed into the darkness like a man who just realized the street isn't the most dangerous place. Tommy cried without sound, and Frank, palms pressed to cold metal, let a faint smile touch his face, like he'd found one weak detail inside this trap, and he was already holding it in his head like a key. This wasn't a resolution. It was only the first click of the lock.